I used to believe my marriage was a perfect picture. 14 years together, 3 wonderful children, a spacious home, and vacations we had always dreamed of. I was a devoted nurse, and my husband, Richard, was an administrator in education. From the outside, everyone said we were the model American family. But one night, as I was plugging in Richard's spare phone in the living room, the screen lit up. A message appeared. Just one line, but enough to shatter my entire world. I miss the way you felt last night. When can we meet again? Signed, Samantha. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I wanted to storm into our bedroom, scream at him, smash everything to pieces. But the next day, I sat across from attorney Catherine Brooks, and her words cut sharper than any knife. If you file for divorce right now, you'll lose the house, the money, and the kids. In this state, infidelity doesn't change a thing. That's when it hit me. If I wanted to protect my children, if I wanted to save my future, I couldn't act on emotion. I had to stay silent and wait. And so began my 3.5-year plan for revenge. For most of my marriage, I thought I was living in the kind of life people envied. My name is Madeline Carter, and if you asked anyone in our neighborhood, they would have told you Richard and I were the perfect couple. We met young, me just finishing nursing school, him already climbing the ladder in education. We built everything from scratch. Our first apartment was so small that our bed touched 3 walls, and the kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people. But we were happy. We had each other, and we had dreams. When our first child, Olivia, was born, I stepped back from full-time nursing to become a stay-at-home mom. Richard and I agreed it was the best choice. He had a steady job at the school district, and we both believed the children should have one of us home. Money was tight, but we managed. Richard even took on extra duties, coaching sports, leading committees, while I pinched pennies at the grocery store and sewed patches onto Jacob's jeans when he tore them at recess. Still, those early years were some of the sweetest of my life. Richard would come home exhausted, but the moment Olivia toddled into his arms, his whole face lit up. I thought, this is it. This is love. This is family. As time passed, our situation improved. Richard moved from teaching into administration, which came with a better salary and, eventually, fewer evening obligations. That gave us more time together, more dinners around the same table. By then, we had welcomed Jacob and then Liam. 3 kids, each so different. Olivia, serious and thoughtful. Jacob, energetic and stubborn. Liam, our gentle baby who still crawled into my lap every morning just to be held. We celebrated small victories like they were huge milestones. Our first used minivan, our first trip to the beach, the day we signed papers for our house in the suburbs. It wasn't a mansion, but to me it felt like a castle. White siding, a backyard big enough for a swing set, and a kitchen where I could finally bake without balancing pans on top of one another. I remember crying the day we moved in, because it felt like we had finally arrived. Richard always said he wanted to give us more. That was the kind of man I thought he was. Driven, dedicated, willing to sacrifice for his family. When he encouraged me to finish my degree and move into a more stable nursing position once the kids were older, I thought it was out of love. He told me, "You've given so much to this family. It's your turn to grow, Maddie." And I believed him. Looking back now, maybe that's why it cut so deeply. Because I had never questioned his loyalty. Even when he started working later hours, I assumed it was ambition. When he bought nicer suits, I thought it was because he was proud of his new position. I told myself we were both just evolving, that the hard years were behind us. I used to sit in our backyard on summer evenings, watching the kids chase fireflies while Richard grilled burgers, and I would feel this overwhelming sense of gratitude. I thought, we've made it. We've built the life we promised each other on our wedding day. What I didn't know was that while I was building a dream, Richard was already tearing it down behind my back. But at that time, in those warm summer nights and quiet family dinners, I was still blissfully unaware. I thought I was safe. And sometimes that's the cruelest part. believing you're living in a dream, not realizing it's just the calm before the storm. Life at home carried on as if nothing had changed. Richard often came home late, always with excuses about long meetings or urgent discussions with colleagues. I never questioned him. He had always been the type to overcommit, and I even felt proud that my husband was so dedicated to his career. But then I began to notice something strange. Richard carried 2 phones. One was his personal number, and the other, he claimed, was his work phone. I didn't think much of it at first. In my hospital, many senior administrators were also issued work phones. He always kept that phone face down on the table or tucked deep in his pocket. Whenever it rang, Richard would step outside to answer, insisting that work required privacy. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Yet the small details started piling up. A faint trace of perfume lingered on his shirts, the kind of bold fragrance I knew wasn't mine. Richard awkwardly explained it away, saying perhaps a female colleague hugged him in congratulations, or maybe someone had stood too close. I swallowed my doubts, forced a smile, but inside, the crack had already formed. The breaking point came one evening when I plugged in Richard's so-called work phone that he had left in the living room. The screen lit up. A message appeared. "I miss the way you felt last night. When can we meet again?" Signed, Samantha. My entire body froze. My heart stopped beating. Every odd piece of the puzzle suddenly locked into place. Richard, the man I had trusted with my life, the father of my 3 children, was betraying me. That night, I sat motionless in the dark, listening to the clock tick, each beat like a countdown to the collapse of my family. I wanted to scream, to storm into our bedroom and confront him then and there, but another voice whispered inside me, "Wait, if you explode now, you'll lose everything." So instead of unleashing my rage, I swallowed the tears. I knew I needed a plan, and to have a plan, I needed the truth. In the days that followed, I lived like a shadow. By day, I still wore my white scrubs, still smiled at patients, still pretended everything was normal. But at night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying that message over and over in my mind. Every time Richard walked out the door with that so-called work phone in his pocket, I felt my heart tighten. I started noticing every small detail. The way his eyes lit up when a text came through, the quick smile tugging at his lips, that same trace of perfume lingering on his shirts. I forced myself to act blind because I knew the moment I confronted him, everything would collapse. The pain wasn't only in my heart, it seeped into my body. I lost weight. Meals became impossible to swallow. At night, I clenched my jaw so tightly I ground my teeth until they ached. One dentist even warned me, if I kept it up, I might need implants. I forced a smile and hid the truth. How could I admit that it was my marriage, my so-called perfect life, that was destroying me from the inside out? I thought about walking away, filing for divorce right then and there. But I knew in this state infidelity meant nothing. If I moved too quickly, I would lose the house, the money, and worst of all, I might lose my children. I couldn't let 3 innocent lives be raised by a man who had betrayed their mother. In my despair, I confided in an old colleague, David Monroe. David had been through a broken marriage himself, and he understood the dark corners of betrayal. I told him everything, my voice trembling like I was confessing a crime. He sat quietly for a long time, then finally looked at me and said, "If you don't like the hand you've been dealt, change the deck." Those words, so simple, struck me like a spark in the dark. I realized I could never win if I played by Richard's rules. But if I was patient, if I arranged the pieces carefully, then one day he would be the one to bury himself. From that moment on, I was no longer the helpless victim. I became a player, and this game would last until I took everything back. From the day I decided to change the deck, I began rearranging my life. I requested a schedule change at the hospital, leaving behind stressful night shifts for a position with less pressure, regular hours, flexible when needed. Some colleagues were surprised. A few even whispered that I was stepping back. But I knew better. This was the first move in a much bigger plan. Every morning, I was the one driving Olivia to high school, Jacob to basketball practice, and Liam to his elementary class. In the afternoons, I picked each of them up and cooked a hot dinner at home. Some nights I sat beside Olivia as she wrestled with advanced math, or spent hours with Jacob practicing his free throws. With Liam, all it took was holding him close and telling him bedtime stories until his little body relaxed and he fell asleep in my arms. These things might seem ordinary, but to me, they were priceless evidence. Quietly, I kept records of everything, from school activities to doctor's visits, building the case that I was the primary caretaker. Richard's absence became more obvious with each passing week. Whenever the kids asked about him, he had the same tired excuse. Work. I'll never forget one autumn evening at the dinner table, when Olivia suddenly said, "Mom, lately it feels like you're doing everything Dad used to do. Without you, we'd be lost." Her words broke my heart and warmed it at the same time. Broke it because it confirmed what I already knew. My husband had abandoned this family long before I ever saw that message. But warm because I realized my children were closer to me now than they had ever been. I was no longer the betrayed woman crying in the dark. I was a devoted mother, patiently building the foundation. And when the time came, I would protect my children with everything I had. I knew that to win this game, I needed two things. First, I had to become the primary caretaker of our children, which I had already achieved. Second, Richard had to be the one earning more money than me. Only then would the legal balance tilt completely in my favor. Richard was always ambitious, and all I had to do was feed that ambition. One evening, when he came home from work, I spoke softly. "Richard, I think you should pursue a master's degree in educational leadership. With your experience, that degree alone could open doors to senior positions." His eyes lit up instantly. I knew that for Richard, the prospect of being respected, of being called a senior leader, was irresistible. He hesitated about the time commitment, but I smiled, squeezed his hand, and said, "Don't worry. I'll take care of the kids. You just focus on studying and building your career. This is your time to shine." Saying those words left a bitter taste in my mouth, but also a quiet satisfaction. Because I knew every class he took, every evening lecture, didn't just bring him closer to his dream, it pushed him deeper into the trap I had set. For 3.5 years, I watched Richard transform. He bought new suits, attended more meetings, came home late with excuses about research projects. I no longer needed proof of his affair. The perfume lingering on his clothes, the playful messages, the excitement in his eyes after work dinners, all of it spoke louder than words. But I kept silent. I let him believe I was still naive, still the quiet, supportive wife. Every time he showed me his grades, I nodded with pride. Every time he talked about the next promotion, I smiled with encouragement. To him, I looked like the loyal partner standing by his side. But in my heart, I knew each step he took was leading him further into the chessboard I controlled. And then, the day he held his master's degree in his hands, promoted to a senior administrator with a salary higher than mine, I knew. The moment I had waited for 3.5 years, had finally arrived. The day Richard received his master's degree and was officially promoted to a senior administrator, I hosted a dinner in his honor. The kids cheered and I smiled as I raised my glass, toasting the pillar of our family. He beamed with pride, hugged me in front of the children, and in that moment, I saw the triumphant gleam in his eyes that he didn't even bother to hide. But only I knew the trap had finally snapped shut. He thought he was winning, but in truth, he had just stepped straight into the noose I had been tightening for 3.5 years. A month later, I quietly returned to attorney Catherine Brooks's office. This time, I wasn't the trembling, tear-stained woman I had been on my first visit. I sat tall, placed a folder of documents on her desk, and said, "It's time." Catherine nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Everything I had meticulously recorded over the years, school schedules, tuition receipts, medical appointments, daily routines, was neatly organized. The evidence was undeniable. I was the primary caretaker. And now, Richard earned more than I did, held the higher position. The court would never side with him. The chosen day was nothing special. A Wednesday afternoon, while the kids were at their grandmother's. A knock came at the door. I opened it to find 2 officers holding a stack of papers. I led them into the living room, where Richard sat on the sofa, still in his crisp suit. "Mr. Richard Carter?" one officer asked. Richard looked up, frowning. "Yes, that's me." "What's this about?" The officer handed him the paperwork. I crossed my arms, locked eyes with him, and said, "This is the divorce petition." "I've known everything." All along, his face drained of color. He jumped up, stammering, "Madeline, what are you talking about? That's not how it—" Before he could finish, his anger flared. He lunged toward me, trying to grab my arm, but one officer immediately stepped in, voice firm. "Careful, Mr. Carter. Men go to jail for domestic violence, too." The room sank into heavy silence. I stood there staring at Richard, the man who once promised me forever, now trembling, furious, and humiliated. In his eyes, I was no longer the naive wife. I was the one holding every piece on the board. And this game was over. On the day of the trial, I walked in calm and steady. Everything had already been prepared. Richard sat across from me, his face stiff, his eyes darting at me with resentment. But this time, he no longer held any control. The hearing moved quickly. The judge reviewed the evidence. I was the primary caretaker, with meticulous records, journals, and testimonies from teachers and doctors. Richard, on the other hand, earned more and held a senior position. The ruling was clear. I was granted full custody of all 3 children. I was awarded the family home, provided I refinanced to buy out his share. Richard was ordered to pay child support each month. He also had to give up his claim to my retirement fund if he wanted to preserve even a shred of dignity. I glanced at him as his face drained of color, his hands trembling as he signed the documents. The once confident man, who thought himself clever and untouchable, now looked like nothing more than a defeated player in a game he never understood. The truth reached our children faster than I expected. Olivia, my eldest, confronted him bluntly. "Why did you need someone else when you already had Mom?" Richard had no answer. Jacob refused to spend weekends at his place, while Liam broke down in tears when he learned about Miss Samantha. Their heartbreak cut me deeply, but those wounds were not carved by me. They were inflicted by Richard himself. And Samantha? The news arrived like a cold slap. While Richard was tangled in meetings and divorce proceedings, Samantha had left him for a better opportunity. Another man, wealthier, younger, more exciting. Richard lost everything: his wife, his children, even his mistress. Some nights, my phone would buzz with messages from him. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. Is there any way we can start over?" I would read the words, then set the phone down without replying. I had cried enough. I had suffered enough. Now all I saw in him was a hollow shell of a man, drowning in consequences he had crafted with his own hands. And me? I still had my 3 children, my home, and the freedom I had waited 3.5 years to reclaim. After everything, my life entered an entirely new chapter. At first, I thought Richard's betrayal would leave a wound that could never heal. But in the end, it became the very force that pushed me to rise, to rebuild my life on a stronger foundation. I devoted more time to my children. Afternoons in the kitchen with Olivia, studying while chatting with me. Jacob, sweaty from basketball practice, still grinning when I handed him a bottle of water. Liam, running into my arms each night whispering, "Mom, I don't need anything else but you. Those moments showed me the truth. I hadn't lost anything. In fact, I had more than ever. Love, closeness, and trust from the very people who mattered most. David Monroe, the old friend who once gave me that crucial advice, slowly became an important source of support. He didn't make grand promises or paint illusions of sweetness. He simply showed up, steady and present for me and the kids. On quiet nights, when the children were asleep, we would sit on the porch watching fireflies, and he would say, "You don't have to be strong all the time. You've already done enough. Now let life be gentle with you." And I would smile. For the first time in years, that smile came from true peace. Richard now is nothing more than a name tied to bitter lessons. He still calls the kids, but they've learned to see through empty promises. As for me, I no longer need to harbor resentment. I had already won, not just on paper, but in the life I was now living. I realized something. Betrayal can shatter a marriage, but it cannot destroy me. Instead, it forged me into a stronger woman, a resilient mother, and above all, someone who finally understood her own worth. Looking back on those 3.5 years of patience, I don't see wasted time. Because today, I have freedom, I have my children, and I have a new life, clean, strong, and full of hope. And I know now from this day forward, nothing will ever break me again. If you believe that betrayal can never destroy a strong woman, if you believe that justice sometimes comes through patience and courage, leave a like on this video. Don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Tales so you won't miss the stories where truth and justice always prevail. And share this video so anyone who's ever been betrayed will remember they can still rise stronger than ever.